Around 1929, there was an abundant amount of food, and it seems that the Great Depression seemed to follow that, where they tanked the stock market so that they could get people into Social Security and higher taxes. Crazy, crazy, crazy stuff about taxes during the Depression and how they increased taxes up to 80% before World War II. And you had Herbert Hoover and then you had FDR, who were part of both of these things. And it's interesting because everything that happened with the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression just doesn't seem to add up. And it almost seems like they had to have an event so they could orchestrate higher taxes, Social Security, and all the other stuff that kind of came with it. And it's actually nuts when you get into it. But I highly recommend everybody check out the videos, look into it. Somebody just said, my great uncle came from Nebraska during the Dust Bowl. Yeah, this is crazy. So there was all these migrants during the Dust Bowl. They were actually leaving Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas and going to California and trying to get into California. And California actually passed a law that didn't allow people to come to their state. If people started showing up from another state, they would send them back or they would try to arrest them. So, when you look at this Dust Bowl incident, you sit there and we have to ask questions about it. And then what's interesting is they were showing that they just kept plowing the land until it turned to dust. And when you think about it and you look at these storms and these big dust storms, and they said that they were electrical dust storms, you sit there and think maybe something else was at play. Maybe it was a move to get people to get out of a certain area. Because when you kind of think about it, like if a bunch of people started farming, they're not going to destroy the soil completely and turn it into a desert. It doesn't make any sense. That's for sure. So I highly recommend people look into this and then look into the Great Depression, 1929, and the whole Hooverville. This was another interesting one. There were these protests by World War I veterans during the Great Depression because they weren't getting paid from what happened during World War I. And the Herbert Hoover actually sent out the military against the military who was trying to get their money for going into World War I. So that's another interesting thing. When you think about what happened in 2020 with the protests and all that other stuff, same exact thing as 1929 and the Great Depression. So what's interesting is when you look at 1920s to 1930s, you see the exact same similarities to 2020 and what's happening into 2024. Same exact things. You see these same patterns. So, and it's just kind of like 2020 and 1976. 1976, you had the swine flu nonsense, that whole thing. And then 2020, they did the same thing. So you see a lot of similarities between this. But the Great Depression was to get Social Security in and get high taxes and to just tax the people. And what was interesting is they also talked about how they would help people farm and understand the land after they destroyed it. So that's another interesting one. Somebody said, can you recommend books before 1910s? Yes, you can go on to eBay, or you could go on to archive.org, or you can go on to Good Books or Abe Books or whichever website you would like to, and look for books before 1920s. Because when you look at the books before 1920s, nothing seems to add up. The biggest thing we have to ask is, when you look at the videos, is humans don't seem to fit into this place. That's the best way to describe it. When you look at these old videos and all the pollution and trash and garbage thrown all over the place and everything's pretty much it just looks gross. That's the best way to describe it. But then there's all these crazy buildings which are absolutely just massive and gigantic. And then you sit there and wonder, well, who built those buildings? Because I was watching a video the other day of about 25 guys trying to build a road without machines. And this is crazy. Like, you watch videos of people trying to build roads without machines. 25, 30 people just sitting working away for 8 hours trying to make a little sand path. Yet you look at these old world buildings, which are absolutely massive and gigantic, these cathedrals and monuments that are just absolutely insane. And you sit there and think, okay, if it took that many people to do that, how on earth did they do that? And it almost looks to me like humans were basically, not say created, but with these orphan trains and these premature babies and Coney Island and that whole thing. You start to sit there and think, all these people were shipped in to a country in which, or were born here and were shipped in or whatever it may be and living here, but confused on how to live. And the real part that blew my mind with the Dust Bowl is that nobody knew how to grow food. There were all these people going into Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma, and just destroying Mother Earth, and nobody knew how to grow food. So how do you go across the country? This is what they're telling us. They go across the country on horse and wagon, destroy the country, but you don't know how to grow food. How could you get across the country without the food? Right? How would you travel across the country without food? If people don't know how to grow food, how did they get here? How did they get to the country? How did they get to America? And these are questions that we have to ask. And I went down this whole rabbit hole of the Dust Bowl and the 1929 Depression, and you start to see that the people who are in America don't seem to be the people who are supposed to be here. And all these buildings that they pretty much took over or inhabited or taken over or stole, whichever it may be, you can see they don't know how to live in them. And then you also start to see that all these buildings didn't have toilets.
So then you start to get into a whole different situation of going, wait a minute, none of these buildings had toilets? And somebody just said Oregon Trail is probably fake. Yes, it is. Oregon Trail. I played that game as a kid. You had to sit there and, your mule would die of dysentery. I remember playing it in 3rd grade. That's all a bunch of nonsense.
They staged all these photos. They staged, the horse and wagon, and, they came with a hammer and a chisel. And let me tell you, I've been watching people do a whole bunch of things and all kinds of stuff with building and everything else. And it doesn't make any sense. There was no hammer and chisel. There was no horse and wagon. There was no Oregon Trail. There was none of that. What there was advanced technology. Now, let's take it one step further. There's underground tunnels all underneath the earth. There's tunnels that are large enough to fit railroads
underneath our feet. So, let's take it a step further. People arrive here after they hijack and steal all these buildings. They get in these tunnels and they actually transport themselves with whatever technology is deep down within the earth, and they get to all these cities. Then they put their name on top of these buildings, claim them, and then say this is Harvard, and this is Yale, and this is the first, Hershey's chocolate, and this is the first, Tiffany's & Co. All these different names. They traveled through the underground part of the earth to inhabit and take over all these different cities. They're coming up from underneath the earth. They're kind of like bugs, And so as they traveled all over the place, then they appeared in these same buildings, which were all old world buildings. They hijacked and took them all over and then rewrote the history. And that's how it actually went down. There was no Oregon Trail and somebody sitting across the wagon. There might have been. Some people might have tried to go with a horse and a wagon, but they probably perished. That's the thing. While people